The night was quiet when the young narrator first heard the clank of armor echoing through the old stone corridor. He had come to learn how real knights fought, not the dazzling swings shown in stories. A grizzled knight named Aldrich stepped forward, his eyes carrying the weight of countless battles. He motioned for the narrator to follow him into the training yard, lit only by torches. Aldrich lifted his sword, not in a grand cinematic arc, but in a short, efficient movement. He explained that battles were won with precision, not flourishes. The narrator watched closely, realizing how different reality was from the legends. Aldrich smiled faintly, sensing the growing curiosity in his student. From the shadows, a woman in chainmail approached, her voice calm yet commanding. She introduced herself as Ser Ilara, a knight known for ending battles without theatrics. Ilara demonstrated how knights often use their swords like levers, not just blades. The narrator felt a jolt of awe as he saw her disarm Aldrich with a simple twist. Ilara told the narrator that real combat was closer than breath, not the distant clashing seen in films. She stepped behind him and guided his hands into the correct stance. He felt the ground beneath him differently, as though it had suddenly become a battlefield. Aldrich nodded approvingly as the narrator absorbed every detail. The training moved to polearms, weapons often misunderstood. Aldrich hefted a poleaxe, showing its balance between reach and control. He struck a wooden post, not with brute force but with targeted precision. The narrator felt the vibration through the earth as the blow landed. Ilara asked the narrator to imagine an armored opponent, not a monster from a movie. She explained how the poleaxe was used to hook joints and pull enemies off balance. The narrator mimicked her movements, surprised by how natural the weapon felt. Aldrich chuckled, saying he learned just as quickly at that age. Night deepened, and the torches flickered like restless spirits. Aldrich instructed the narrator to focus on footwork above all else. He moved gracefully despite his bulky armor, each step deliberate and soft. The narrator tried to match the rhythm, feeling clumsy but determined. Ilara stepped to the narrator's side and whispered encouragement. She told him that knights survived not by strength, but by understanding timing. Her voice carried a warmth that contrasted the cold steel around them. The narrator felt a surge of motivation swell inside him. Aldrich suddenly called for a mock duel between Ilara and the narrator. The narrator's heart pounded as he raised the training sword. Ilara moved lightly, testing his footing rather than attacking. He managed to block her first strike, surprising them both. Ilara offered a rare smile, praising his instinct. She pressed forward, showing how knights closed distance quickly. The narrator stumbled, but regained balance, remembering Aldrich's teachings. Aldrich cheered, his voice booming across the yard. The duel ended with Ilara gently tapping the narrator's shoulder with her blade. She told him that losing with dignity was the first step to winning with wisdom. The narrator bowed respectfully, feeling pride despite defeat. Aldrich clapped his hands and announced a short break. They gathered near the fire pit, armor warming in the glow. Aldrich began sharing stories of real battles, not exaggerated tales. He described the fear, the noise, the heavy air filled with grit. The narrator listened, realizing the courage hidden behind every calm knight's face. Ilara added her own memories, softer but equally powerful. She spoke of saving comrades by making simple, swift choices. The narrator sensed the weight of her words, heavier than armor. He felt honored to learn from those who had lived the truth. Aldrich handed the narrator a wooden practice shield. He explained how shields were not merely barriers, but weapons. He demonstrated bashing, hooking, and redirecting with stunning agility. The narrator practiced, feeling the solid thud with each movement. Ilara guided him through shield and sword coordination. She corrected his angles with gentle taps of her gauntlet. The narrator gradually felt the rhythm of the shield dancing with the blade. Aldrich grinned, saying the student was finally becoming aware. The wind grew colder as the training approached midnight. Aldrich lit additional torches, casting long shadows across the yard. Ilara called for one final drill to test everything learned so far. The narrator took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next. The two knights stood opposite him, moving slowly in a synchronized pattern. They wanted him to observe, not react. Their movements revealed the truth behind real combat, measured, efficient, purposeful. The narrator felt as though he were glimpsing a hidden language spoken only by warriors. The night ended with Aldrich placing a hand on his shoulder. He said that the path of understanding had only just begun. Ilara reminded him that skill grew not from glory, but from patience. The narrator walked back to his quarters, mind racing with everything he had seen. As he lay in his bunk, he replayed the lessons again and again. He no longer cared for the flashy battles shown on screens. He wanted to learn the real art, the quiet, disciplined truth of knighthood. Sleep finally took him, carrying him into dreams of steel and torchlight. Morning light crept across the training yard as the narrator awoke to the sound of clashing steel. Aldrich was already drilling with another knight, their movements sharp and economical. The narrator hurried over, eager to join them. Ilara greeted him with a nod, placing a practice spear in his hands. She explained that spears were the true kings of the battlefield. Their reach made them deadlier than most swords in real combat. The narrator tested the weight, feeling its balance. Aldrich circled him, correcting his grip with a firm tap. They practiced thrusting, not wildly swinging like in movies. Ilara showed how small adjustments could slip past armor gaps. The narrator felt a thrill each time the spear tip landed precisely. Aldrich praised the quiet focus growing in his eyes. Next came formation training, something films rarely portrayed correctly. Aldrich lined the students shoulder to shoulder with shields. They learned to move as one body, not as individual heroes. The narrator felt the power of unity ripple through the formation. Ilara commanded them through simulated charges. The shields crashed forward with disciplined timing. The narrator staggered at first, but then matched the rhythm. Aldrich shouted encouragement that echoed across the yard. They rested briefly under the shade of an oak. Aldrich spoke of real battles where formations saved lives. He described the chaos when one person broke rank. The narrator listened, realizing how discipline shaped survival. Training resumed with dagger drills. Ilara explained that daggers were used as last resort tools, not dramatic spinning weapons. She guided the narrator through close quarters movements. Each step reminded him of how brutally intimate real combat could be. Aldrich paired the narrator with another trainee. They practiced grappling, using daggers only for finishing strikes. Sweat soaked their tunics as they struggled for advantage. Ilara watched closely, correcting their stances with calm authority. The sun dipped lower as wooden dummies were brought out. Aldrich taught them where armor was weakest during real battles. The narrator aimed for joints, neck gaps, and underarm spaces. Each strike felt like uncovering another hidden truth. Ilara demonstrated how knights used half-swording techniques. She gripped the blade itself for control, shocking the narrator. He tried it cautiously, realizing the practicality behind the unusual grip. Aldrich nodded, pleased by the growing understanding. As evening approached, Aldrich gathered them for a sparring circle. Ilara stepped forward to face the narrator again. This time he felt ready, steadier than the night before. The circle quieted as their blades met. Ilara moved with fluid grace, testing his reactions. The narrator countered with practiced precision. Aldrich shouted corrections, urging sharper footwork. The duel intensified until sweat trickled down the narrator's brow. A sudden feint from Ilara nearly disarmed him. The narrator twisted at the last moment, maintaining his grip. Aldrich laughed proudly at the clever recovery. Ilara's smile returned, warm and approving. The duel ended with no clear victor. Both lowered their blades in mutual respect. The watching trainees erupted in applause. The narrator felt a deep sense of belonging. They ended the night around a crackling fire. Aldrich spoke about the loneliness that often accompanied knighthood. He said courage wasn't the absence of fear, but mastery over it. The narrator absorbed every word, feeling his resolve strengthen. Ilara shared a quieter story about a battlefield at dawn. She spoke of a fallen friend she once carried to safety. Her voice trembled just slightly, revealing the grief beneath. The narrator felt an ache in his chest, moved by her honesty. Aldrich placed another log on the fire, sparks swirling upward. He reminded them that real knights fought to protect, not to conquer. Their duty was heavier than any sword they carried. The narrator felt the truth settle deep inside him. Stars filled the sky as training concluded. Ilara dismissed them with a gentle wave. Aldrich told the narrator he had potential few possessed. The narrator walked back to his quarters, heart full and restless. As he lay down, he thought of everything he had learned that day. The weight of real combat felt both terrifying and beautiful. He vowed to honor the lessons Aldrich and Ilara had shared. Sleep claimed him once more, carrying him toward the next dawn. The narrator woke to the rumble of distant thunder, though the sky was clear. Aldrich explained it was not weather, but armored riders training beyond the hill. Curiosity pulled the narrator toward the sound. Ilara followed, her cloak fluttering softly behind her. At the ridge, they saw mounted knights practicing real battlefield maneuvers. Aldrich said movies rarely showed the precision needed on horseback. Each rider controlled their mount, with subtle shifts of weight and reins. The narrator watched, mesmerized by the harmony between human and horse. Ilara introduced him to a calm chestnut mare named Rowan. She explained that knights trusted their horses as partners, not tools. The narrator gently stroked Rowan's neck, feeling her steady breath. Aldrich chuckled, saying she accepted him quicker than most. They practiced mounting techniques first. Movies showed dramatic leaps, but real knights mounted efficiently and safely. The narrator learned to swing into the saddle with controlled balance. Ilara steadied him when he wobbled, her hand firm on his arm. Next came slow riding drills. Aldrich instructed him to feel the horse's rhythm instead of forcing it. Rowan moved with surprising grace under him. The narrator felt a deep connection forming with every step she took. Ilara demonstrated how to use weapons while riding. She showed that real mounted combat required timing, not sweeping blows. The narrator tried striking a dummy with a practice sword, missing narrowly. Aldrich encouraged him, saying precision would come with time. They shifted to lance training, the most misunderstood skill of all. Aldrich explained the true purpose of lances in controlled cavalry charges. The narrator balanced the long weapon awkwardly at first. Ilara guided his arm, helping him find the right angle. As he rode toward a target for the first time, nerves took over. Rowan sensed his uncertainty and slowed. Ilara called out gently, telling him to trust both himself and the horse. The narrator breathed deeply and tried again. This time, the lance struck the target squarely. Aldrich shouted triumphantly, proud of the clean hit. The narrator felt a rush of confidence bloom inside him. Rowan snorted, as if celebrating too. After dismounting, they rested under a tree. Aldrich spoke of real cavalry lines crashing into enemy ranks. He described the dust, the noise, and the terrifying momentum. The narrator imagined himself there, heart pounding. Ilara added that knights often avoided unnecessary charges. She said strategy mattered more than dramatic action. The narrator admired her calm intelligence. Aldrich nodded, saying she had saved countless lives with her caution. They returned to the training yard for ground exercises. Aldrich wanted the narrator to balance both mounted and foot combat skills. They drilled transitions between weapons, shifting from sword to poleaxe. Ilara corrected his foot placement each time he switched stances. Sweat glistened on everyone as the sun climbed higher. Aldrich kept pushing them through grueling defensive drills. The narrator's muscles burned, yet he pushed on. Ilara whispered encouragement whenever he faltered. They practiced binding techniques, moments when blades locked. Aldrich showed how knights used leverage to control these clashes. The narrator tried to mimic the subtle pressure changes. Ilara praised him when he finally moved with steadiness. A break was called as the heat intensified. The narrator drank deeply from a water skin Aldrich offered. He listened as the older knight explained the mental strain of real combat. Fear, he said, was always present. Discipline kept it from ruling. After resting, they moved to shield walls again. Ilara emphasized quick reaction to incoming strikes. The narrator braced behind his shield, feeling each blow reverberate. Aldrich reminded him to stay loose, not rigid. Their final session focused on battlefield communication. Ilara shouted coded signals across the yard. The narrator learned how knights conveyed messages mid-fight. Aldrich said miscommunication had cost armies entire battles. Evening settled with a violet glow across the sky. Aldrich dismissed the trainees with pride in his voice. Ilara lingered, offering the narrator one last piece of advice. She told him that understanding the truth of combat required humility above all. As he walked to his quarters, he reflected on the day's lessons. Rowan's steady gait, Aldrich's booming voice, Ilara's quiet wisdom, all echoed in his mind. He felt himself slowly transforming, not into a hero, but into someone wiser. Sleep arrived quickly, filled with dreams of hooves and steel. The narrator awoke before dawn, stirred by the sound of soft chanting. He followed the echo to a secluded courtyard, where Aldrich stood alone. The older knight moved slowly through a series of controlled motions. Ilara watched from a distance, her expression calm and unreadable. Aldrich explained that knights practiced these forms to steady the mind. He said battles were won long before steel clashed. The narrator mimicked the slow movements, feeling balance settle in his body. Ilara approached, correcting his posture with gentle precision. They transitioned into armor maintenance. Ilara showed how dents and cracks revealed the truth of past fights. The narrator traced one such mark on Aldrich's breastplate. Aldrich said every scar on metal carried a story worth remembering. They oiled leather straps and polished chain links. The narrator learned how vital these rituals were for survival. Ilara explained that poorly kept armor failed when most needed. Aldrich nodded, saying discipline extended beyond the battlefield. After preparations, they moved to terrain training. Aldrich led them through the forest behind the stronghold. He taught how knights adapted to mud, roots, and uneven ground. The narrator stumbled once, but quickly learned to read the earth. Ilara demonstrated silent movement in armor. The narrator was shocked by how quietly she stepped. He tried to imitate her, focusing on controlled breathing. Aldrich watched with pride as the narrator improved. They practiced ambush defense next. Aldrich reminded them that knights were often targets, not hunters. The narrator crouched behind a fallen log, heart pounding. Ilara signaled the mock attackers to move in. Wooden blades struck suddenly. The narrator reacted with a raised shield and sharp counter. Aldrich shouted praise for his quick instincts. Ilara stepped beside him, offering a rare approving nod. Training shifted to reading enemy intent. Aldrich explained how tiny movements revealed upcoming strikes. The narrator studied Ilara's stance, predicting her feints. She smiled when he blocked her first attack cleanly. They paused for water by a small stream. Aldrich told stories of battles fought near rivers and cliffs. He described how terrain often decided who lived and who fell. The narrator listened intently, absorbing every detail. Ilara taught about stamina management next. She explained how knights timed their efforts to avoid exhaustion. The narrator practiced short bursts of offense, followed by controlled retreats. Aldrich clapped approvingly as his movements grew smoother. They returned to the main yard for partner drills. Aldrich paired the narrator with a stronger trainee. The narrator learned that technique outweighed brute strength. Ilara murmured encouragement as he held his ground. Afternoon heat pushed them into shaded sparring rings. Aldrich demonstrated grapples used to disarm armored foes. The narrator practiced cautiously, feeling the weight of realism. Ilara corrected each misstep with patient guidance. They moved to shield-breaking drills. Aldrich swung with controlled but heavy strikes. The narrator learned how to absorb impact without losing balance. Ilara showed him how to counter with swift footwork. As shadows stretched long, the final exercise began. Aldrich created a simulated battlefield with moving targets. The narrator navigated through strikes, shouts, and shifting obstacles. Ilara watched, judging not skill alone, but composure. The narrator finished breathless but triumphant. Aldrich placed a hand on his shoulder, proud of the progress. Ilara simply said, "You're learning the truth." Her voice carried the weight of both warning and praise. They walked back to the stronghold as the wind cooled. Aldrich discussed tomorrow's advanced training. Ilara reminded him to rest well. Mind and muscle both needed recovery. The narrator felt exhaustion mixing with growing confidence. That night in his quarters, he lay awake for a long time. He replayed the lessons, the voices, the rhythm of survival. The truth of knighthood no longer felt distant or glamorous. It felt real, heavy, honest, and strangely beautiful. The narrator woke to the clang of bells, signaling a full-day assessment. Aldrich explained this was the test that separated trainees from true apprentices. Ilara handed the narrator a set of freshly tightened armor straps. Her steady gaze told him she believed he was ready. They began with endurance drills across the hillside. Aldrich set a relentless pace, expecting silence and focus. The narrator pushed through burning muscles and rising breath. Ilara jogged beside him, offering quiet corrections to his posture. At the summit, they transitioned to long-range observation skills. Aldrich taught how knights read formations from a distance. The narrator identified shapes and movements far below. Ilara smiled softly, impressed by his growing awareness. They hiked down to a narrow ravine for defensive tactics. Aldrich explained how terrain like this could trap or protect soldiers. The narrator practiced blocking attacks from tight angles. Ilara demonstrated how to redirect force instead of resisting it. Next came weapon switching under pressure. Aldrich timed him as he moved from sword to dagger to poleaxe. The narrator stumbled once, but recovered with determination. Ilara whispered that adaptability saved more knights than strength. Afternoon sun lit the yard as the sparring phase began. Aldrich paired the narrator with 3 rotating opponents. Each fought with different styles and speeds. The narrator learned to adjust rather than predict. Ilara stepped in as the final challenger. Her movements were precise, calm, and deeply intentional. The narrator matched her with newfound focus. Aldrich watched, pride glowing in his eyes. Their blades met in controlled intensity. Ilara probed for weaknesses with subtle feints. The narrator blocked, stepped, and countered with clarity. Aldrich muttered, "He's becoming a knight." The duel ended with Ilara lowering her sword first. She nodded with rare approval. The narrator bowed, heart thundering with gratitude. Aldrich declared he had passed the first half of the assessment. They moved into decision-making trials. Aldrich created battlefield dilemmas requiring fast judgment. The narrator weighed options under intense time pressure. Ilara observed his reasoning with quiet satisfaction. One scenario simulated wounded allies trapped behind enemy lines. The narrator chose a strategic retreat, followed by a flank maneuver. Aldrich called it the smartest choice of the day. Ilara's expression softened with quiet pride. Another scenario involved holding a narrow bridge. The narrator used shields and positioning instead of brute force. Aldrich praised his grasp of real-world tactics. Ilara whispered that wisdom often outweighed courage. As the sun lowered, they moved to instinct tests. Aldrich stood behind him, striking without warning. The narrator reacted with sharp, clean reflexes. Ilara nodded, saying instinct sharpened only with truth, not fantasy. They concluded with emotional resilience exercises. Aldrich spoke of fear's shadow in every battle. He asked the narrator what frightened him most. The narrator admitted he feared failing those he wished to protect. Ilara stepped closer, her voice gentle as wind on steel. She told him that fear guided knights as much as bravery. Aldrich agreed, saying courage lived beside fear, not against it. The narrator felt a profound shift inside him. Evening fell, filling the sky with deep blue hues. Aldrich officially announced the narrator's advancement. The trainees cheered as he stood humbled and overwhelmed. Ilara placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch steady and proud. They walked back toward the fortress in quiet unity. Aldrich discussed tomorrow's lessons on real battlefield psychology. Ilara told him to rest, for growth required stillness as well as effort. The narrator returned to his quarters, filled with gratitude and resolve. He lay awake long into the night. The weight of the day settled on him like a cloak of purpose. He realized he was no longer simply learning about knights. He was learning what it truly meant to become one. The narrator woke to the sound of distant horns echoing through the valley. Aldrich explained that today they would study real battlefield communication. Ilara handed him a small horn carved with intricate patterns. Its weight felt symbolic, like a tool of both warning and unity. They began with signal drills across the open fields. Aldrich demonstrated the short blasts used for retreat. The narrator practiced until the sound carried evenly across the wind. Ilara corrected his timing with patient precision. Next came long-distance flag signaling. Ilara raised colored banners, shifting them in practiced sequences. The narrator learned how each motion conveyed urgent messages. Aldrich praised his quick ability to interpret the patterns. They moved to elevated ground for observation practice. Aldrich taught him how to read dust clouds, stirred by marching troops. The narrator identified a simulated enemy approach with surprising accuracy. Ilara smiled, impressed by his growing instincts. Back in the yard, they trained for low-visibility combat. Aldrich filled the space with smoke pots to mimic battlefield fog. The narrator moved cautiously, relying on sound instead of sight. Ilara guided him with soft verbal cues, her voice a steady anchor. They practiced shield line communication next. Aldrich tapped the narrator's shield in coded rhythms. Each tap signaled movement, defense, or formation shifts. The narrator responded fluidly, gaining confidence with each step. After a short rest, they transitioned to emotional endurance training. Aldrich spoke about staying calm when chaos exploded around them. The narrator listened closely, feeling the gravity of each word. Ilara added that clarity under pressure often saved entire units. They entered the hall for ethical decision drills. Aldrich presented scenarios with no perfect answers. The narrator learned to weigh lives, risks, and consequences. Ilara observed, measuring not his strategy, but his heart. Outside, clouds gathered overhead. A sudden storm rolled in with heavy rain. Aldrich announced they would continue training regardless. The narrator braced himself, ready for the challenge. They practiced movement on soaked ground. Ilara demonstrated how slippery terrain shifted balance. The narrator nearly fell twice, but adjusted quickly. Aldrich shouted encouragement above the pouring rain. Next came storm combat simulations. Water blurred their vision as they exchanged strikes. The narrator stayed focused, despite the challenging conditions. Ilara nodded approvingly as he adapted to the shifting ground. The storm eventually eased. Aldrich led them to the stables for mounted drills. The narrator worked with Rowan again, feeling comfort in her presence. Ilara tightened his saddle straps, ensuring his balance stayed true. They practiced riding through mud-soaked fields. Rowan's hooves splashed through puddles with steady rhythm. The narrator held his stance even during sudden turns. Aldrich praised his improved control. As the sky brightened, they shifted to rescue techniques. Ilara demonstrated how to lift wounded allies onto mounts. The narrator practiced until the movement felt natural. Aldrich emphasized the importance of saving lives over winning battles. Back in the courtyard, they reviewed everything learned. Aldrich asked him to explain each communication method. The narrator recited flawlessly, his voice steady and confident. Ilara gave a rare smile of complete approval. Evening shadows stretched across the stones. Aldrich dismissed the trainees with a proud nod. Ilara lingered, reminding him that mastery was a lifelong journey. The narrator bowed, grateful for her guidance. He returned to his quarters exhausted. Yet his heart felt stronger than any previous day. He sensed himself stepping deeper into the truth of knighthood. Sleep came peacefully, carrying him into another night of purpose. Dawn spilled pale light over the training ground as the narrator laced his boots. Aldrich handed him a small satchel with maps and a single candle. Ilara warned that understanding a battlefield meant understanding its map. The narrator studied the lines like a student learning a new language. They moved to cartography sessions under a low canopy. Aldrich traced routes where armies once marched, pointing out choke points. The narrator learned to fold and refold the maps until the paths lived in his hands. Ilara quizzed him with sudden questions to sharpen his recall. Later, they practiced night navigation with only stars and whispers. Aldrich taught the narrator to mark landmarks by sound and scent. The wind carried distant smoke, and the narrator guessed its origin correctly. Ilara nodded, pleased that his senses were aligning. They rehearsed covert approaches through a maze of hedgerows. Aldrich explained how silence moved like armor over the land. The narrator crept, feeling the world shrink to the size of his heartbeat. Ilara mouthed directions, her voice a soft compass in the dark. Midday brought lessons on supply lines and rationing. Aldrich described how scarcity turned plans brittle as dry wood. The narrator practiced dividing rations fairly among mock civilians. Ilara watched to ensure his decisions balanced mercy and necessity. They trained rescuing trapped wagons from muddy ravines next. Aldrich demonstrated anchoring techniques and pulley logic. The narrator learned that engineering could be as decisive as courage. Ilara praised his patient problem-solving, not his haste. After a brief rest, they studied tracked signs in the earth. Aldrich showed how footprints told stories of weight and hurry. The narrator traced a path of retreat and named its likely leaders. Ilara smiled at his growing ability to read hidden narratives. They practiced forming quick field hospitals using blankets and bark. Aldrich insisted that saving the wounded preserved morale and strength. The narrator learned to staunch a wound with calm hands. Ilara taught him how to speak softly to those in pain. As dusk neared, they rehearsed signal relays across hills. Aldrich explained how a simple mistake could break an entire chain. The narrator coordinated 3 runners with steady, clear commands. Ilara approved his concise cadence, calling it precise and humane. That night, in the mess hall, they discussed the cost of prolonged campaigns. Aldrich spoke of homes left behind and crops left untended. The narrator felt the weight of those absent faces fold into his resolve. Ilara reminded him that every strategy touched people beyond the battlefield. They closed the day with quiet reflection beneath a single lantern. Aldrich asked the narrator what kind of leader he wished to be. The narrator answered that he wanted to be remembered for saving lives. Ilara placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said, "Then begin today." Morning brought a messenger with news of a nearby skirmish. Aldrich read the courier's words aloud and folded them with steady hands. Ilara explained that rumors often carried more fear than truth. The narrator volunteered to scout, eager to test his skills. He rode with Rowan toward the reported clash zone. The path narrowed as the landscape sharpened into watchful trees. The narrator felt every twig announce his passing like a small alarm. Ilara followed at a cautious distance, her eyes scanning the canopy. They found only scattered tracks and an abandoned campfire. Aldrich noted signs of hurried departure and organized retreat. The narrator pieced together who had passed through and where they went next. Ilara commended his careful reconstruction of movement. They tracked a fleeing party to a ruined stone bridge. Aldrich warned of ambushes near ruined crossings. The narrator advanced slowly, shield raised and senses alert. Ilara signaled, and the two moved as one, silent as shadows. At the bridge they encountered a band of frightened villagers. Aldrich soothed them and offered protection without a demand. The narrator learned how authority asked for trust rather than demanded it. Ilara organized a safe escort to lead them away from danger. They spent the afternoon helping rebuild a damaged cart. The narrator tightened wheel braces and learned to bind splintered wood. Aldrich explained that rebuilding was more honorable than razing. Ilara taught the narrator to measure joy in the village's quiet repairs. That evening brought a lesson in diplomatic restraint. Aldrich posed a mock negotiation between rival farmers. The narrator mediated with calm words and careful fairness. Ilara praised the honesty in his voice, saying truth steadied talks. They returned under a sky full of quiet stars. Aldrich told a story of leaders who forgot the people they served. The narrator felt the thread of responsibility tighten around his heart. Ilara said that leadership began with listening, not orders. Before sleep, Aldrich handed him a small wooden token. It was carved with a simple knot, a reminder of community. The narrator slipped it into his pocket, feeling its weight like a promise. Ilara watched him tuck it away and smiled with quiet approval. The cold wind swept the training ground as autumn edged closer. Aldrich announced lessons on winter campaigning and shelter building. Ilara taught how to choose camps that guarded against both wind and surprise. The narrator learned to layer tarps and stack insulated bedding with care. They practiced ration stretching techniques by the fire. Aldrich demonstrated boiling bark to extract flavor in lean times. The narrator discovered small comforts could lift weary spirits. Ilara made them hum a simple tune to keep morale steady. They moved on to tracking in snow-dusted fields. Aldrich showed how fresh prints betrayed movement across white plains. The narrator traced a column's cautious passage and marked safe routes. Ilara commended his patience. Cold required a steady mind. Next came lessons in frostbite prevention and warming methods. Aldrich taught friction techniques and shared old remedies. The narrator learned to recognize numbness before it became danger. Ilara sat close by and taught him to treat hands with care and gentleness. They practiced winter reconnaissance under muted skies. Aldrich urged them to use fog and snow as cover, not hindrance. The narrator crept through silence, feeling like a note held between breaths. Ilara's whispers guided him like a quiet northern star. Afternoon turned to a tender session of storytelling to keep spirits bright. Aldrich recounted a winter where kindness saved a whole company. The narrator felt warmed by the memory of shared bread and laughter. Ilara added that small joys were weapons against despair. They rehearsed rescuing sleds from icy ravines next. Aldrich showed rope techniques and safe harnessing methods. The narrator executed each step with rising confidence. Ilara praised his steady hands and steady heart. As dusk fell, they practiced signaling in whiteout conditions. Aldrich taught mirror flashes and the rhythm of repeated beats. The narrator timed each flash until it spoke like language. Ilara said the night listened when commands were clear and kind. The day closed with a shared bowl of thin stew. Aldrich reminded them that preparation kept people alive. The narrator sat quietly, imagining futures where preparedness spared families. Ilara said softly, "You carry other people's tomorrows now." The final stretch of training felt different. Less teaching, more testing. Aldrich arranged a full mock campaign across varied terrain. Ilara briefed them on objectives that required judgment, not force. The narrator felt a nervous excitement like the first breath before a race. They moved through valleys, forests, and ridgelines as a single unit. Aldrich evaluated not only skill, but compassion and decision-making. The narrator found himself choosing paths that protected civilians over glory. Ilara watched his choices, measuring integrity as much as technique. Mid-campaign, a wounded courier crossed their path. The narrator paused his march to tend the man's injuries. Aldrich observed, then nodded. Actions spoke louder than words. Ilara helped bandage the wounds and arranged safe transport. As the campaign reached its climax, the scenario shifted unexpectedly. An ally force feigned retreat to lure them into a trap. The narrator noticed inconsistencies and halted the advance. Aldrich grinned, proud that caution had saved lives that day. They executed a careful flanking maneuver instead. Ilara led with calm commands while the narrator supported the rear. The opposing force faltered when met with coordinated restraint. Aldrich declared the exercise a success. Tactics and mercy had won. That night, under a vault of countless stars, Aldrich finally spoke plainly. He told the narrator that training had not made him perfect, but reliable. The narrator understood that reliability is what others depend upon in darkest hours. Ilara added that true courage was choosing kindness when it cost you. They returned to the stronghold for a final ceremony. Aldrich presented the narrator with a simple crest stitched onto a cloak. Ilara invited him to stand and address the gathered trainees. The narrator spoke with a voice steady and honest about duty and care. He finished by asking everyone to promise to protect lives, not treasure honor. The trainees responded with solemn nods and quiet vows. Aldrich smiled, saying, "This is how truth becomes tradition." Ilara stepped forward and placed the cloak on his shoulders. Before the story ends, please subscribe to USA Sleepless Tales for more true, heartfelt stories. Join the channel for updates and new narratives that touch the heart. Thank you for listening and for honoring stories of courage and care. May every listener carry a little of this truth into their own night.